Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today we are doing episode 4 of the RFK miniseries. So far, we've covered in episode 1 the facts of the case, just the evidence that emerged from the uh, obviously you've got the covers, the government narrative, what happened, but then you had the evidence, you had the autopsy, you had the ballistics report, the eyewitness testimony, et cetera, and the two were in conflict. If you looked at just the straight evidence and then matched it or juxtaposed it against the government narrative, what happened at the trial, uh, the there was no consistency between the two. In episode 2, because of that inconsistency, we went into the possibility of a second shooter. And of course, the autopsy proved that there had to be a second shooter because there were shots from the front and shots from the back. And the shots from the back proved to be the ones that were fatal. And the guy they had standing trial for the murder of RFK was always the one in front. So clearly a second shooter. The ballistics report also pointed to that, saying there was at least 12 to 16 bullets. Sirhan's gun only held 8. So we looked at the second shooter and identified him as Thane Eugene Caesar and all of his CIA connections. And the fact that he had a 22, lied about it, tried to hide it, and but they never questioned. They didn't ever confiscate his gun, check his gun, et cetera, and he was allowed to live out his life. Meanwhile, Sirhan was in episode 3. We got into his trial and talked about how they rigged the trial, starting with uh, the appointment of a lawyer who was conflicted, to say the least, whom they had leverage over, whom, generously speaking, giving him the benefit of the doubt, blew the case. Uh, Whether it was out of incompetence, I highly doubt it was incompetence, since he was the lawyer for uh, Mickey Cohen and Johnny Rosselli. These mobsters need good lawyers. They're not going to hire bad lawyers. So he was clearly a good lawyer, but he sure didn't act like it in the Sirhan case. Never brought up any of the physical evidence, never brought up any of the ballistics, never brought up any of the autopsy. In fact, convinced Sirhan to confess. And at some point during the trial, Sirhan figured out uh, that he was being sold down the river by his own attorney. He went to the judge, tried to get out, got to try to fire his own attorney, tried to get out of his confession. Judge wouldn't allow either one. Then we find out that the LAPD sent a criminalist who was lying on the stand about the bullets they found in RFK. He claimed that those were the bullets that came from Sirhan's gun. They didn't. They came from a locker in the LAPD evidence room. And we found out about that in the 80s when somebody went back into his cases in the 70s and found a pattern of lying on the stand. He'd done it many times. And that was the star witness that the district attorney put on the stand to help convict or nail down a conviction of Sirhan. Then we found out, so the district attorney was in on it. So you got a corrupt LAPD criminalist testifying, you got a corrupt district attorney, you got a judge who's ramrodding through uh, this these corrupt proceedings, won't give Sirhan the benefit of a second attorney, an attorney maybe who isn't conflicted, won't allow him to change his mind on the confession. Then you've got the guy who's running the case, LAPD. The two guys running the case are both CIA guys. Uh, we talked about Manuel Perez and Pena, actually, and then we also talked about Enrique Hernandez. Enrique Hernandez's job was to use his position as the polygraph expert to get the narrative right. Right, he browbeat the people that didn't give the agree with the government narrative. Uh, he ignored the statements of people who testified that against the government narrative, and they'll just continue to use the polygraph sessions as a way to craft the narrative. And there's evidence of that because they had him on tape doing it. And then the guy who's signing off on all the evidence and choosing who the witness is going to be and deciding how the case is going to proceed, Manuel Pena, we found out, had been 7 months before the trial of Sirhan Sirhan, had quit LAPD to go work for USAID USAID, US aid, which is obviously a front for the CIA. And that wasn't the first time. Turns out it wasn't a deal where he quit, took a different job. He was just reassigned. His main employer was the CIA throughout the last 10 years, according to an FBI agent, Lajeunesse, and according to his own brother. Pena had worked for the CIA for the past decade. And so he was periodically reassigned. 7 months before the RFK thing, he was reassigned down to Latin and South America, specifically to work in training locals in how to run police investigations and also in training people how to do assassinations. Pretty convenient. Then uh, in April, he comes back to LA, rejoins the force there, and is put in charge of the most famous, most high profile case in the nation at that time. Um, and he's got all these connections to the CIA, and we've already learned that the second shooter, whom I believe is the assassin of RFK, had connections to the CIA. So you've got the gunman with connections to the CIA. Today we're going to learn that the patsy had connections to the CIA unwittingly, and we have the two guys in charge of the case with connections to the CIA. And then we finished up yesterday, and I barely touched on it, but we're going to talk about it in depth today. The LAPD department, the entire department had connections to the CIA because they were working together on a special operation called Operation Chaos, which, as I was leaving yesterday or signing off, I said it was the CIA's version of the FBI's COINTEL program. Operation Chaos was the CIA version. And they were both programs to infiltrate and discredit civil rights organizations and also war protest organizations. And through different means, as we're going to discover today, they're going to use infiltrators. They're going to try to cause them to create to act criminally, violently, and then use it against them to discredit them in the eyes of the American people. And that's going to go to a whole nother level because of the science provided by these Nazi doctors through Operation Paperclips. We're going to learn how to do this stuff. We're going to borrow the expertise of the Germans, the Nazis, and apply it here at home and abroad and in our cities, uh, and use it against our own populations. We experimented at first against other populations, and then when the Korean War ended and the Vietnam War ended, we didn't have those foreign populations as our little, uh, petri dish anymore. And so we had to start doing it against, experimenting with our own population. And so that's where we are today. And I wanted to introduce a new source today because this is an important. I've gone through all these other sources uh, several times. So there's the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Lisa Peace book, and there's William Pepper. William Pepper is going to grow in influence as we get into the Martin Luther King series next. What a unique individual! What a uniquely positioned person to have information on both of these cases, RFK and MLK. I'll talk more about William Pepper in the next series, but he was a source. Talbot with his book Brothers, these two books, Mark Shaw, especially Collateral Damage, a lot of background information there. But the one I want to talk about today mostly is Tom O'Neill's book Chaos. And this is, in my view, the definitive book on Operation Chaos. And by extension, you learn a lot about what the FBI was up to at the same time with COINTELPRO because they're virtually the same, just operating out of different parts of Washington, but they're virtually the same. Tom O'Neill is an interesting story. He did not write this book in a year. It took, I think it was close to 30 years to write this book. It was a long time, and he went, he virtually was bankrupt. It started off as he was assigned writing for a magazine. He was assigned to write a story. It was on an anniversary of the Charles Manson killings, and so he was assigned to write a story on Charles Manson. And boy, once he got into it, the story just kept growing and growing. It had more and more legs to it, and it took him in places he never dreamed This is not a guy on a witch hunt. This is not a guy looking to solve the JFK case or the Jack Ruby case or Charles Manson case or the RFK or MLK. He wasn't trying to solve any of those cases. He was just trying to started off trying to write a piece about Manson. And then as the story took him in deeper and deeper, he became immersed in it and sort of obsessed with it. And it cost him several jobs along the way. It cost him a ton of money. He lost book contracts. He lost, as I said, he lost jobs. Uh, even even lost places to live at different points in time, and had to borrow money from his parents to sort of finance his journey in the writing this book. It's a long story, but it's a worthwhile read, and you can catch him on YouTube and kind of get some of the gist for it. He's a real mellow guy, he's not real excitable, and he only deals in what he knows. It's sort of frustrating listening to him sometimes because the hosts will sometimes, and he even says this in his book, there's this tendency or this desire to want to speculate, and he won't do it. He won't do it. He won't publish anything. He won't say anything on podcasts unless he's sure of what he's saying. So anyway, that's a picture of him in the middle there, and those are his notebooks. He kept a notebooks. This is how he categorized everything into these notebooks. And he said, before I started this project, I didn't have any of these notebooks. Had never done a research project of this uh, in depth before. And he says, over 30 years, you collect and you collect and you collect. And he's meticulously cited and referenced and documented everything. And that book, Chaos, came from all those notebooks. And of course, when the reason he has a co-author, you see his name, Dan Piepenbring, is because O'Neill says the book was 600 or 700 pages long, and no one would publish it. To get it down to a workable length, he had to hire someone who was an expert in these sorts of things. And so that's the expertise that Dan Piepenbring brought to it. He wasn't necessarily the researcher. O'Neill did all the research. Piepenbring helped him uh, narrow the topic down a little bit. So he said, I could have written 5 or 6 books on this topic. But anyway, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, the history, the uh, the progression as we work through the years, and how chaos came to be. You got to tell the backstory. That's one thing O'Neill really did a good job of in his book, is bringing us up to speed. History does not happen in a vacuum, and you arrive at a point as a result of several other points along the way that you arrived at previously, and you look back over that period of time, and you've come quite a ways. By the way, the Tom O'Neill, the whole book was the whole thesis of the book was, well, the whole purpose of the book was to write about Charles Manson, and what he found as he got into the Manson story was that Manson, the story that the American people heard about Manson, is not the story, or not what really happened. And there was a district attorney in L.A. Stop me if you've heard this before, Vincent Bugliosi, who made a fortune off this case. He had an author who was present at all the proceedings during the case, and that was really the purpose. Bugliosi wanted to write the definitive book, Helter Skelter, on on the Charles Manson case, make a bunch of money off of it. Of course, I think it got turned into a movie at some point. By the way, Vincent Bugliosi also wrote a very thick book about the JFK assassination in defense of the lone gunman narrative. Uh, I'm personally familiar with this because my dad kept throwing it in my face all these years. He was a very, very, Vincent Bugliosi had a really good name as far in law enforcement circles. When he starts writing these books, he's sort of the definitive voice. He had a lot of credibility. And one of the things Tom O'Neill does is completely undercut the credibility of Vincent Bugliosi. When you find out what Tom O'Neill has to say about Vincent Bugliosi, calls into question everything in this Manson trial, number one, which turns out to be totally bogus, the helter-skelter motive, everything. But it also calls into question everything he wrote about JFK. And You know, you see this oftentimes, these guys that are the spokesperson for the government, they get these big government book contracts and all these big high profile cases. I noticed the other day, I didn't even realize this before. As I've started my MLK research, I found out that Gerald Posner has written a book in defense of the lone gunman narrative in the Martin Luther King case. And of course, he's the guy who wrote the book Case Closed about how Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone nut, the lone gunman in the JFK assassination. And he's always on TV. Every time there's one of these documentaries or movies, they go get Gerald Posner to regurgitate the government line. And hard telling how much money he's made off Case Closed. And now he's done the same thing with the MLK case. And so they recycle these guys. And these guys are the ones that get the book contracts. So anyway, very interesting book. A lot of good information in it, and a lot of historical stuff that goes well beyond just the Charles Manson case. You want to learn about U.S. history and some of the hanky panky our government's been up to. Dive down into the well of chaos. Uh, get that book Tom O'Neill wrote, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I wanted to introduce that source. So let's talk about the origins of Operation Chaos. I'll make my face a little smaller here. This is a picture of Harry Truman signing in 1947 the National Security Act, which created the CIA. And so it's 2 years after World War II. And during World War II, we didn't have a CIA, we had an OSS. And the OSS was phased out and replaced by the CIA. In 47, excuse me, got an itch there. The Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah became the first domestic human experiment uh, labs. And there's a gassing chamber for human tests with the Nazi Tabun nerve agent. And I told you at the end of yesterday, or episode 3, that this Operation Chaos is going to be the roots of it come from Operation Paperclip and all these Nazi doctors and physicists and scientists, et cetera, who came. They should have been tried at Nuremberg. They were war criminals. All of them were war criminals. I mean, to the last one. Uh, but instead, we exempted them from Nuremberg. We told the American people we were trying all the worst Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. That wasn't the case. The poor suckers that got tried at Nuremberg were the ones who didn't offer any value going forward to either us or the Soviets. So we bring 1,500 of the high value targets back to America, and we scatter them all around the United States to help with our space program, to help with chemical and biological war weapons, and some of them helped with nuclear. The nuclear program the Germans had was far superior to us. The rockets that they were producing, the V1, V2 rockets, we couldn't even get a rocket off the launch pad. We learned everything we came to know about rockets. We learned from the Nazis. Uh, anyway, they were spread all across the United States, and they had all kinds of different nerve agents that they had uh, invented and developed, and some of them were locked up in they were in these warheads. They had, after the war, we found huge warehouses full of these V2 rockets that had never been fired, and they had warheads full of these nerve agents. And the question was, why didn't Hitler fire these things? He could have fired them at London, and instead of burning London to the ground, he could have gassed all the people and killed them. He could have done it in any number of places. He never used them. Now, it's not to say he didn't use chemical or biological weapons. He did. But when at the end of the war, when they were desperate, you would think a desperate man, a desperate country, desperate generals, a desperate Adolf Hitler would have resorted to using these. He didn't. But they had this expertise. They had been developing it for such a case. They just never chose to use it, which is an interesting study in and of itself. So I told you all these scientists come back to America, and we start using the ones that had expertise in these chemical weapons, these biological agents. we put them at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. We put them at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, in faraway places, right, out of the way locations. And we began human experiments uh, using the expertise that the Germans are teaching us about gas chambers, which of course they learned from their, where the concentration camps. And we began conducting our own human tests using their gas, this Tabin nerve agent. And from these tests came this new concept of war called psychochemical warfare. A new concept of war. It was actually it's a book, it's a pamphlet, it's something that is taught or was taught, probably still is, in war colleges, so to speak, like probably at West Point, whatever. And what the Germans had been trying to develop is a way to incapacitate the enemy before you fight him. So it's sort of like preparing a field of fire in advance of the invasion. And if you can use these nerve agents, and there's all kinds of delivery systems. So you could use V1, V2 rockets. You could, back then, right? You could use other delivery vehicles or delivery instruments like mosquitoes or, or fleas or, different ways. You could drop it. You could use it in the form of aerosol and drop it like we did in Vietnam. There's all kinds of delivery agents that were still in the experimental stage. But as far as the gas was concerned and its effect on humans, the Germans were fully aware of the effect Tabin gas had on human beings because they did it against their own people. Um, and then we brought them here, and we started doing it here. And as I said, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. So this is the beginning. This is the opening of Pandora's box. And that brings us, you remember after the war, uh, we controlled the western part of Europe, specifically Western Germany. The Soviets controlled East Germany. And so, in order to hide or, you know, cloak what we were doing away from the American people, prying eyes of American media or whomever, one of the most clandestine U.S. intelligence centers was in West Germany at Camp King. And this served as a quote, as a joint interrogation and intelligence center. So Berlin and Germany was like the intersection or the front lines of the Cold War. And we had spies, and the Soviets had spies, and they were capturing our spies, and we were capturing their spies. And so they're interrogating ours, and we're interrogating theirs. And so clearly the Soviets had their intelligence in Berlin or in East Germany. We have our intelligence in West Berlin or West Germany. And when we capture their spies, we bring them to our side, we interrogate them. They're doing the same to us. Well, we have now at our disposal these Nazi scientists. And we began experimenting using methods that they had perfected during World War II of extreme interrogation techniques, in other words, torture, and also behavior modification programs. In other words, we're learning at the feet of these Nazi doctors and these scientists and all of these former Nazis who have been experimenting and had no qualms about experimenting on human beings. They had no ethical hangups. It's one of the reasons why Nazi medicine was so superior to our medicine or anyone else's medicine, because we would experiment on pigs or we would experiment on mice because we thought it was unethical to do it on humans. Well, the Germans had no such hangups. Read some of the experiments that Dr. Mengele was involved in some of those concentration camps like Dachau, and doing it to real people, Jews. They had a steady stream of a ready supply always at for these kinds of experiments, and we wouldn't cross that line. Well, after the war, we began crossing that line, and it was one of whether the Germans encouraged us to do it or whether we just decided to do it. I don't know, but we did. And it coincidentally was at the same time that we began utilizing these Germans, these Nazi doctors, in our experiments. So some of the experiments involved hypnosis, electric shock, chemicals, street drugs, illegal drugs. And we would use these on prisoners that we believed to be Soviet spies. So we'd capture somebody we accused of being a spy. And our rationale was, well, they deserve what's coming to them. And it's over here in West Germany, hidden away behind fences and this intelligence center, this interrogation center. And we can do pretty much anything we want. The American people will never know. And so but we're also doing it on American soil in Maryland and Utah. Um, eventually, back in Maryland, the Army transformed a camp called Camp Dietrich into a state-of-the-art bioweapons research and development facility. It had two parts to it. It had Area A, which was the R&D part of the facility. And then they also purchased an additional 550 some odd acres of land adjacent to Area A to create a testing field for pathogens like anthrax and the plague. So you've got two things going at Camp Dietrich. You've got the R&D where you're developing these bioweapons, and then you've got the Area B where you're testing them. And it's super secret, Camp Dietrich. And they were using these Operation Paperclip scientists. They were looking at specifically, this is documented. Okay, so if you get into the Chaos book by Tom O'Neill, he's meticulously documented all this stuff. Assassination by poison, which in the 60s we're going to try to use against Castro, right? Biological weapons to initiate epidemics. You'll see where we tested that later. Chemical nerve agents such as Soman. This is a nerve agent that was developed first in Germany. Now we're trying to develop it here in America. And the newly developed ultimate incapacitation chemical, LSD. You know, it's interesting when we get into the 60s and LSD starts proliferating on the city streets. Everybody wonders, where the hell did that come from? I mean, you don't grow LSD. It's a chemical. It's something that's developed in a lab. LSD didn't exist until our government, the Army, Camp Dietrich, and these scientists developed it. And they released it into the general population. Does that sound familiar? Having just come through a situation similar to that, this is not a virus, but it's a drug. And the supply of LSD all came from the US government. So here we have what's going on at Camp Dietrich. And now we need a guinea pig population where you can test it on. And voila, mid 50s, we get involved in the Korean War. And so this begins the CIA directed LSD experiments on enemy combatants. This is all supposed to be research, a continuation of Camp Dietrich research. But now on the front lines, we're using it against POWs, Korean War POWs. And we also used biological weapons. So we're using chemical agents against these POWs, and we're also using biological weapons against the population. Parasitic flies, dropping them from planes, anthrax, and other diseases. We're trying to poison the population with these diseases to help us win a war. And again, remember what the purpose of this is: to incapacitate the enemy before you have to invade, before the actual war. And so this is like the next phase of warfare, right? To incapacitate your enemy before the war. Well, eventually the Korean War ends. We continue this research and development and all the testing at Camp Dietrich. We're continuing our efforts in West Germany at the Camp King. It's all super secret. We've got facilities in Utah and Maryland. And then the Vietnam War breaks out. And of course, this happens right on the heels of JFK's assassination, when it really turns up, the dial gets turned up. And so we see another opportunity because of another foreign population to expand our experimentation on another foreign civil group of civilians. And so we launched, this is a CIA program, the Phoenix program. And the question is, well, what is the Phoenix program? It's literally a killing program. According to their own documents, it's a killing program. The goal was to collect intelligence, get intelligence out of the enemy, and use enhanced interrogation or torture. All this expertise that we learned at Camp King, remember in Germany, we're going to now apply that in a practical way on the battlefront in Vietnam. And I say this is aimed mostly at the civilians because most of the people fighting that we were using this against were civilians. We would go into a village and we'd ask them what they knew about the movements of the Viet Cong or whatever. We'd capture a bunch of them. If they wouldn't talk, because a lot of them were afraid of the Viet Cong too, we would torture them. And we'd use this Phoenix program to get information out of people. Now, we don't have any what we would consider to be rock solid as far as the accuracy of these records are concerned. But it's estimated that during the Vietnam War, which went on a lot longer than the Korean War, we killed through this Phoenix program 26,000 North Vietnamese citizens, civilians. Now, some of those may have been combatants, right? Because they didn't wear uniforms. It's hard to tell the difference who was who. These are not just North Vietnamese. Some of these are South Vietnamese, people that we were supposedly fighting for. Anybody that we wanted to get information out of. 26,000 people. And we're using these enhanced interrogation techniques that these Germans had taught us. We're using a combination of drugs, LSD, we're using chemical and biological agents. We're also using torture tactics. Now, if you ever, I did a video series on, well, I don't know if I did a video series on it or not. I used to teach it in history class. I'd do a whole day on all the different so-called medical experiments that were happening at Dachau and Buchenwald and Auschwitz, places like that, all in the name of science and medicine. It was just torture. That's all it was. It was torture. And these are the people we're learning from. They're the ones doing. They're our teachers. And so that's how 26,000 people died. All right. So eventually the war ends, and we lose our ready supply of human guinea pigs to continue this testing. So now we've got to figure out, we want these experiments. We're learning, and every time we learn something new, it expands these experiments and the possibility of what we can do with these chemical and biological weapons. And so we want to learn more. And so Operation Chatter happened after the war, and the goal was to use LSD as a truth serum during interrogations. What if we could apply LSD, which in the process of interrogation, and because these folks are trained, or just like we're trained, to not give up what you know. So they're very good at lying, being deceptive. So the question was, is there any way we can cut through the bullshit, so to speak, when we're interrogating these POWs or whomever, and cut through the bullshit and get to the truth? Is there a drug, potion, or a potion of a drug that we can apply to this person, or inject into this person, or give to this person in some way, shape, or form that will cause them to lose their inhibitions, so to speak, and not be able to stop from telling the truth? A truth serum. And we conducted this operation was called Operation Chatter. It was conducted in Bethesda, Maryland. Everything's happened in Maryland for some, not everything, but you had Camp Dietrich was in Maryland. You had the original testing there in the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. Now you've got the Naval Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. And this program was modeled after the Dachau mescaline experiments, where they did the same thing using mescaline instead of LSD. And we got these same Nazi doctors telling us how they did it in Dachau, and now we're doing this pretty much the same thing in Bethesda, Maryland. And the eventually uh, another operation that comes out of this overarching chemical and biological agents uh, experimental phase is Operation Bluebird. This was later renamed Operation Artichoke. So if you ever hear artichoke, it's bluebird. If you hear bluebird, it's artichoke. They're one and the same. This is an overseas operation that took place in Europe, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. All these places where we have, I wouldn't call them colonies, but we control, or we have some semblance of control in these places. And we have these foreign populations pretty much at our mercy. These experiments were also chosen to be in certain places because the populations there were perceived to be weaker and less intelligent segments of society. This is the same model the Nazis used. When they rounded up people and put them in concentration camps, they said the rationale they gave their own people was, well, these weren't humans. These are subhumans. The Jews are not human. So we don't have to treat them like humans. We can do anything we want to them because they're not human. This same model we took and we began uh, using all of these same tactics that we've already used against the Koreans, we've already used against the Vietnamese, and we've already used them against some of our own people in some of these experiments that have been taking place at home. And then the idea was, well, uh, as we continue this, uh, the last thing we need is American people getting wind of what we're doing. We've got all these people in Europe under our thumb, specifically in uh, places in Europe that were relying upon us for their defense during the Cold War. Japan was under our thumb after World War II. Southeast Asia, specifically the Philippines, was under our thumb after World War II for a period of time. So it's like this is a perfect location. It's a perfect place, logistically speaking, and in order to keep it a secret. The goal was to create in Operation Bluebird, the specific goal of this operation was to create involuntary assassins by hypnosis. In other words, to program someone to commit an assassination, hypnotize them, program them, and has some kind of activating agent or activating code, whatever, that would, they would be inactive, and then all of a sudden you activate them and now they're active and they go carry out the assassination while they're hypnotized, and then when they get arrested afterwards or whatever happens afterwards, they can't remember anything. It's followed by amnesia. They can't remember who told them to do it. They can't remember why they did it, any of the details, who sent them. They can't remember anything. In a lot of cases, they can't even remember their own identity. If you've seen any of the Jason Bourne movies, the Jason Bourne series is based on it's a fictional series, but it's based on true events. It's based on Operation Bluebird. And if you remember, Matt Damon, the character, the man who played the actor who plays the character Jason Bourne, throughout all these movies, he's always trying to find out who he really was. He can't remember his real name, his past. He can't remember why he failed at one mission, succeeded at another, who sent him. He's trying to retrace his past. And of course, that becomes a real danger to the CIA, so they target him. He's an agent that's gone rogue. He's he's a danger to them because he could expose what they've been up to. So I put that picture on there just because it's rooted in truth. Operation Bluebird was about creating assassins, involuntary, which means they would not do this in and of themselves. It wasn't their idea. They are programmed through hypnosis, a combination of hypnosis and drugs. And then afterwards, they had this severe amnesia, can't remember anything. The experiments would include forced morphine addiction and then withdrawal. Um, I think in one of the Bourne movies, he's coming on. I think it's the last one, as they're trying to phase out the program. They're trying to go around, round up all these assassins that are scattered to the wind, four winds all around the world, and they're they're trying to phase them or take away their meds, and these guys are dropping like flies because they can't survive without their meds. And even Jason Bourne, and he has to partner up with a nurse who sort of nurses him through this stage of, where you come down off your meds and you dry out, so to speak. And but anyway, so they get them addicted to morphine, and then they withdraw, and they're testing them just to see what the human limits in these situations are. They also use dengue fever and other diseases. In their documents, they said, "quote Not all viruses have to be lethal. The objective includes those that act as short-term and long-term incapacitating agents." So, which one would be handy for a short-term incapacitation? What would be a long-term incapacitating agent? And they're testing on their own people. These as they're trying to create these superhuman uh, assassins, I guess. They used cocaine, marijuana, heroin, peyote, mescaline, LSD, all these different drugs. That's what Operation Bluebird was. And of course, remember now, they're experimenting on these people that they perceive to be weaker and less intelligent segments of society. So it's a very Darwinian uh, kind of a social Darwinism kind of approach to life, where the strong survive, the weak are less fit, the unfit will eventually become extinct because they're unfit. And we can do anything. The fit can do what they want to the unfit because the fit deserve to survive and prosper and flourish, and the unfit deserve to die, become extinct because they're unfit, right? Um, Eugenics came out of this whole thing, where you have a lot of people don't realize eugenics really started here in America. And you want to know the truth of it, Hitler borrowed our understanding of eugenics and put it into practice in a way nobody had ever seen before in Germany, but it came from America. It came from the West. And so this is how we're justifying this Operation Bluebird. Eventually, because what we're learning through this operation is advancing so quickly, they merge Bluebird and Artichoke, which technically were two separate operations, kind of doing the same thing. They merge them into one, and it became the umbrella for all this mind control became a program called MKUltra. And this is straight out of the Nazi archives, straight out of the Nazi uh, experiments and these Nazi doctors. They even kept the same name. MKUltra was the name the Germans used for the same mind control program back in Nazi Germany, the heyday of Nazi Germany. We didn't even change the name. We kept the same name, Mind Control Ultra. The only difference was we add the word ultra to the end. That was Alan Dulles' word. Mind control. If mind control should be spelled MC, not MK. But MK is how the Germans spell it. We kept the German spelling of it even when we create our own operation here, because it's pretty much we're learning it from them. So we kept the name. And Dulles adds the word ultra to the end of it because he says, if this works, this will be the my biggest accomplishment. This will be the achievement above all achievements as far as intelligence is concerned. We can program human beings to do whatever we want and then have no memory of it afterwards. This is if we can achieve this, if we can master this, it will be, it's one thing to master yourself, it's another thing to control someone else and have them do your bidding. And that's what this would be. And you could sacrifice people left and right through this combination of drugs and hypnosis to achieve whatever it is you want to achieve. It would be a feather in the cap for any intelligence official who could successfully engineer this. And that's what Dulles was hoping to do. So, as we learned, MK is German for mind control. The goal was to modify human behavior through covert means. And you're going to use a combination of drugs and hypnosis. So you got you're hypnotizing people, but you're also uh, injecting into them or uh, into their bodies LSD, ecstasy, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, meth, on and on and on. And this is to conduct mind control, information gathering through interrogation. Uh, we've already conducted the experiment on truth serum. We've learned that LSD is hugely important in getting truthful, credible information from enemy combatants or POWs. It works. We've learned that through psychological torture experiments, like electric shock, for example, you can accomplish a lot of the means of getting information. I mean, these are all things that we have been learning at Camp King in Germany as we capture these enemy POW, these POWs or these Soviet spies. We capture them and we use these drugs on them. We use this psychological torture experiments like electroshock. We all this is, and of course we've got our own experiments going on now with Operation Bluebird and Artichoke and all these Southeast Asia and European countries, and we've got stuff going on in Maryland at Camp Dietrich where we're coming up research and developing all these drugs and we're testing them next door. I mean, we are really fully invested in this program, and it's top secret. It's so top secret that when whispers started to get out about MKUltra, uh, Sidney Gottlieb, the guy that Alan Dulles put in charge of it, ordered all the documents destroyed. And it's been really hard to learn in years later, later years, to about what the extent of this program was because they destroyed all the documents, almost all of them. Some of them survived. Anyway, during this period of time, more than 150 human experiments, and during this MKUltra program, more than 150 human experiments took place in the U.S. and Canada, in hospitals and universities like Columbia and Stanford. We know those two were involved. Prisons, where you've got, again, unfit population, right? 80 prisons total. Uh, there were 185 researchers being paid by the U.S. government through CIA to conduct all this research. Now, the reason why MKUltra begins conducting all this research here at home is because we don't have a steady stream of foreigners to use forever and ever and ever. The Korean War served its purpose for a while. The Vietnam War served its purpose for a while. In Operation Bluebird, Artichoke, we started off over in Southeast Asia and we started off in Europe, places, Philippines, and places like that. Um, but we brought it home and we began experimenting. I didn't list it here. Also, our soldiers. We experimented on our own soldier population. Um, and folks in hospitals, mostly young people, or mostly universities that we would, they're kids away from home for the first time, and they get recruited into this testing program, not really realizing, of course, this is a period of time when these kids want to do drugs anyway, so this is free drugs, right? And so not realizing they're part of a CIA experiment, MKUltra experiment. Some of the unwitting victims that we know of, and there's a lot that we don't know of, but there's some that we do know. The first one was one of their own. Dr. Frank Olson was one of these CIA scientists who had a crisis of conscience at some point, realized, what are we doing? We're playing, we're playing God here. This is an awful thing we're doing to people. And he expressed some reservations to his superiors, and something mysterious happened to him one night. They say he committed suicide, jumped off a tall building in New York City, fell to his death. I don't buy that for a minute. I'm pretty sure he was pushed off that out the window of his hotel room. But anyway, he died, and um, then one of the most famous was Theodore Kaczynski, who was, I think, to this day, one of the youngest students to ever enter Harvard, and was just a brilliant. He was sort of a genius. And because of his age, 15, 16, whatever he was, he got recruited by his advisor, who was a CIA asset, into this program, and they literally broke his brain after about 2 or 3 years in the program. And he just dropped off the grid. And the next time he appears, and he starts mailing bombs to all these government facilities around the country, he writes a manifesto. And by the manifesto, the FBI could tell the guy was a genius. They just couldn't figure out who he was. He, and they finally found him. He was in a cabin out in Montana. So that's the Unabomber. Another one, and relevant to our case and our study of the RFK assassination, Sirhan Sirhan. The suspicion that he was one of these programmed assassins. We'll get into it here a little bit. But and then Whitey Bulger, the Boston mobster, who until he went to prison um, was basically just a petty criminal, not a violent criminal, just petty criminal. Then he went to prison. He ended up being in one of these prison studies for MKUltra. When he comes out of prison, he is all of a sudden a violent criminal, and basically, and he became an informant for the Boston police, the FBI, and the CIA, whomever, in Boston, running around, running wild, became this notorious criminal, very violent. And something happened to him while he was in prison, because the kind of criminal he was before did not line up or align with the kind of criminal he was afterwards. And of course, he got all kinds of special treatment through all these years later when he kept committing these crimes and getting away with it. Um, Here's a few pictures. We're just kind of going through the history here of how this all started. All started when we brought these German scientists back and asking them about all their experiments. And they start telling us, and we realize how much we don't know. And so they start teaching us. And we set up a couple facilities here at home. And then we set up a big facility in West Berlin to handle all the Soviet spies that were captured. And we start experimenting with truth serum and all these electric shock and trying to get these experiments that would get the truth out of these spies during these interrogation sessions. And boy, we're learning. Then we get Korean War breaks out. We start using some of the biological agents, chemical agents against the Korean population, and the Vietnam War breaks out. And we use them as the guinea pigs. Operation Phoenix kills about 26,000 of these Vietnamese civilians. And no matter, we don't care. It's interesting to me, as I teach history sometimes, we talk about chemical weapons, and it's always in a very negative, it's a very pejorative thing. It's a very negative thing any country would ever resort to using chemical weapons. And remember when we talk about the Iraq War and the idea that Saddam Hussein was this evil guy because he gassed his own people. And we talk about Hitler gassing the Jews. And we talk about, you know, in Syria, Assad gassing his own people. And boy, what terrible folks these guys. And what's never in the history books is the fact that we gassed Koreans and we used chemical and biological weapons against the Vietnamese, or not the Vietnamese, and then in MKUltra we're doing it against our own people. You never see that in the history books, but it happened. It happened. Uh, Top left is a picture of Sirhan. Sirhan question their article, was Sirhan hypnotized? Top right, this was the Frank Olson guy I was telling you about. He was the scientist working with the CIA helping develop MKUltra, who later either A, jumped to his death or was pushed to his death, died uh, shortly after he went to his superiors and expressed reservations about what they were doing. Bottom left is the Unabomber, the mad genius. You can see the picture there in the inset of him as a young man at Harvard. And then when he was captured, transformation, he just sort of dropped off the grid. Whitey Bulger's the guy on the bottom right. This was his first. You can see he's at Alcatraz, one of the most notorious prisons in America. And after that stint at Alcatraz, Whitey Bulger became a completely different kind of criminal. And even said so later that he had become part of a government experiment while he was in prison. It was out of his own mouth. He volunteered that information. And he did it because he was trying to stay alive. And in that prison, you could be protected if he was a young guy and he was looking for some sort of protection. The government said, "We'll protect you if you'll be in our program." And and then afterwards, when he got released, it was another form of protection. As he commits all these criminal acts, as long as you inform for us, we'll not arrest you for what you're doing, kind of a thing. So he did it for protection purposes. The ambitions of MKUltra was to obtain control of the future activities, whether physical or mental, of a person, whether they're willing or unwilling, it didn't matter. And then afterwards, they'd have amnesia, as we mentioned earlier. Uh, Moral concepts were an obstacle, right? They've always been an obstacle. It makes me think about Charles Darwin, you know, uh, when the British East India Company wanted to practice population control by killing people, using the Malthusian war, famine, disease, and any other checks on population they could think of. It wasn't a real problem in the East because they weren't Christian, that part of the world. But in the West, most of the people were Christian. And Christians don't believe in murder. They don't. They have a moral objection to, uh, mass murder and genocide. So the reason Charles Darwin was sent out by the British East India Company was to find an alternative explanation to how the origins of the human species, because these daggum Christians believe God created them, and if they believe in God and creation, they're never going to agree to genocide. Who gives us the right to play God? But if we can somehow undercut Christianity, and the first story in the Bible is creation, if we can prove that there's an alternative explanation of how we all got here, that'll undercut the credibility of the Bible. It'll undercut the credibility of the creation story. It'll undercut God. We can replace God with secular humanism. And then, uh, you know, once we've overcome that obstacle, we can make an argument that genocide is okay for this reason or for that, because population control, if we allow the population to expand too fast, it won't be enough food for everybody. And so in order to keep the food supply above the population level, we got to practice genocide, but we got to get past this moral objection. This is the first time this has happened. So here we have uh, a situation where the CIA is trying to figure out how can we get people to act against their own moral concepts, to make an individual perform something like, say, a murder or an assassination, which in most situations uh, people would have an objection to, rightly so. But if we can control their activities through a combination of hypnosis and drugs and destroy their memory of it so they don't have to deal with guilt afterwards, or they can't possibly uh, tell who told them to do it and reveal these secrets. This is the ultra that Alan Dulles was dreaming of. This is the mind control, the ultimate weapon in this intelligence game between us and the Soviets. If we can somehow figure out how to control people's minds, that's the point of this. All right. I know you're probably wondering, well, when are we going to get to the RFK part? Well, we'll get to it. I'm building the case here. Um, One of the offshoots of MKUltra was this program, Operation Midnight Climax. This is an MKUltra project that used prostitutes in big cities like LA, and these prostitutes would lure unsuspecting men, Johns, to CIA safe houses that were scattered across the cities. And one of the primary locations of this was LA, also San Francisco, where there were a lot of hippies, in the 60s. And they would lure these unsuspecting Johns to the CIA safe houses for sex. That's what they are, they're prostitutes. And once they got them there, they would drug them up. So it's like a bait and switch. You lure them to the safe house as a prostitute selling sex, and then you get them there and you involve them in these drug experiments. And of course, once you enter that CIA safe house, the CIA people take over, right? So the only purpose of these prostitutes was to lure them into the safe house. Anyway, the CIA would dose these men with LSD and then watch behind two-way mirrors as these Johns and these prostitutes had sex, and they would sit there with notepads and write down how the LSD they'd have before and after, like sex sessions before the LSD was applied and sex sessions afterwards, and they'd note the difference of the men's behavior once they were uh, injected with LSD or had partaken of LSD. They use mostly hippies in San Francisco and New York for their experiments. And you're talking about people that have, these are runaways or hippies they're not checking in with mom and dad every night. That's for sure. So they have a steady stream of population of people that uh, want the drugs. Number one, they're on the search for drugs, cheap drugs that uh, and they're willing to try. They have no inhibitions. They're hippies. They'll do just about anything. And it became like a thing to do. And no one's missing these people. No one's looking for them. No one's checking on these people to find out what's going on with these folks. The goal was to see if LSD paired with sex could be used to coax sensitive information out of people. It's like a honeypot experiment. You use the sex as the honey, and then you use the drugs, the psychedelic, and you're trying. It's another version of a truth serum. And so this is going on and I said it was New York and San Francisco. It was also in LA, different places. Uh, the Haight-Ashbury project, uh, which was financed by CIA as part of Operation Chaos, uh, actually took it to a whole new level. This whole mind control idea. The idea was, can we create an LSD cult? Can we recruit these disenchanted wanderers, these hippies, whoever? Can we create a crackpot who would sort of become like their leader? And then we've experimented on him with hypnosis and sex and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And now, because of what he's learned, he can use that same training on these disciples, these folks that flock to him. And so you're gonna try to recruit people that can go out and recruit for himself a little cult, like a little family, so to speak. This is where the Charles Manson stuff comes in, and uh, this is the CIA's version of what the FBI is doing. The FBI is actually actively trying to infiltrate groups like the Black Panthers, uh, civil rights groups, um, also these war protest movements, and they're trying to infiltrate and rat fuck them from within. And if you followed any of my uh, series prior, you know what rat fucking means. It means to get inside and just destroy it from within and discredit it from within. Get them to create to cause crimes or commit crimes. Get them to do things that you can later reflect poorly on the group, reflect poorly on the civil rights movement, reflect poorly on the war protest movement, and the American people would turn against it. Right? That's what FBI COINTELPRO is all about. That's why they were surveilling, they were infiltrating, they were propagandizing, they were trying to turn one group against another and create these intramural rivalries, so to speak, that would turn violent. All this stuff was going on at FBI. Well, the CIA is doing the same thing with chaos. And the two guys that were the guy who was kind of over all this, the CIA version, was Sidney Gottlieb. He's the MKUltra director, and he's got all these offshoots going. He's got Chaos. He's got the Haight-Ashbury Project. He's got, we just talked about in the prior slide, Operation Midnight Climax. It's all this experimental stuff trying to control people's minds and their behaviors. and their memories. The CIA's HAP director for Sidney Gottlieb running this program at Haight Ashbury was Dr. Louis Jolyon, nicknamed Jolly West. Now, if you have followed any of my JFK stuff, you know that Jolly West was the doctor that was sent to interview Jack Ruby before the Warren Commission came and interviewed him. And it's awful interesting that Jolly West, who's working with this mind control program, is the guy chosen to go talk to Jack Ruby right before Jack Ruby has a quote psychotic break with reality and becomes a blathering idiot. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the goal was to create this cult. All right, you recruit yourself a leader, and you do all this training, hypnosis, and all the drugs, and through him, he recruits. And you say, well, how does he recruit these wanderers and these hippies? You give him all the free drugs he can handle. And these ne'er-do-wells, these wanderers, these hippies, always on the search for drugs, will be drawn to somebody who can use drugs as a recruitment inducement to follow him around. And of course, once they get hooked, they need that fix. And so they'll follow him around wherever he goes and do anything he says in order to get their fix. And that's how you create this cult. So the whole purpose of the Haight Ashbury Project was to recruit these disenchanted wanderers. They'd flock to this crackpot, and it'd be mostly these, like I said, a lot of them were runaways. If you listen to interviews of Charles Manson's family, a lot of those girls that were in his family, not just girls, some of them were guys as well. Most of them were girls. They were runaways. They'd fled their homes in Middle America, whatever. They wanted to go out and live wildlife. So they're just out there looking for anybody and anything can give them a taste of this wildlife. And Manson, who had no job, you wonder, well, how is he getting his drugs? The CIA was giving him all his drugs. And so he had an unlimited supply of LSD, for example. And these kids had this pathological desire to withdraw from reality and craved belonging to something, which is why he called it a family, and also partaking in some kind of forbidden activity. If you look at Charles Manson's family, it was wild sex, uninhibited sex, sex all the time, with all kinds of partnering and different uh, groupings, and it's just free love, right? Free love is what they called it, and mixing and matching, and it's unbelievable some of the stuff that was going on. Another thing that he was paying for, by the way, and being financed the CIA, was for them to have abortions and health care. Because when you participate in all these forbidden activities, the drug use, the sex, you're going to have venereal diseases, you're going to have STDs, you're going to have issues with drug, all that kind of stuff, dirty needles, whatever. So, but the whole point was to use those as inducements to create this little cult, to create this little family, and you have the head of the family who's really just a puppet for the CIA, and the whole purpose is you're literally controlling everyone's behavior that's in this experiment. That's the whole point of MKUltra, mind control. You're taking people who may not, in and of themselves, do these things, but because you're controlling them through a combination of hypnosis and drugs, which one of the things about the girls said about Charles Manson after he was arrested and all the murders and things that happened. In interviews, they all said that Manson hypnotized them. In other words, the CIA recruited him into the program, hypnotized, used drugs on him, trained him in all these tactics, and then he used this training on his converts, on his cult, on these girls that followed him around, and then used drugs to keep him coming back, keep him coming back, keep him following him around. And this group becomes a little cult. They go out into the desert and they live together, and they have this sense of belonging. They belong. He's sort of the head of the household, so to speak, and they're all his family. That was what the Charles Manson cult was all about. It was a CIA part of Operation Chaos, part of, and of course, the part that relates to Operation Chaos is eventually, once you get them all hooked, and once they're all part of the family, and once they need their fix, and they'll do anything to follow this guy around, then you control their behavior and in such a way that you get them to commit a crime, a murder of some sort that they wouldn't ordinarily do. You give them the drugs beforehand, they have amnesia afterwards. And not only have you trained one person to literally be a trained assassin free, but you've used that person to train several others. And so by extension, you're creating, instead of just one programmed assassin, you now have a whole family of programmed assassins. And so you're the training, and of course, if you aim that in a certain direction, which is what Tom O'Neill uh, says in his book, the whole point of this was to go after, to send the Manson family after prominent white people, young people, beautiful people, right? Actors. Sharon Tate was out there, in LA, in exclusive neighborhoods. Folks understand crime happens all the time in downtown LA, in the bad section of town, but do this out in the hills, the Hollywood Hills, right? In the the areas on the outskirts of town where all the rich people live, and paint these slogans on the wall: kill, pig, helter skelter, all this kind of stuff, race war, and scare the white population, scare uh, white America into thinking that this is a race, sort of the beginning of a race war, and that these people, what the government was going to do was blame this crime on, uh, you know, they could blame anybody. It's like a false flag. You could say, well, Black Panthers did this, and they're targeting white kids, and this would cause the white population in America to grow very fearful of any of these civil rights organizations. Or you could say it was the hippies who did it, these war protesters, and it caused the American population, mostly the white population, to grow very fearful of these violent hippies, these drugged up, violent hippies who are running around killing white people. And that's the chaos part of it. Remember, chaos was the CIA's version of COINTELPRO, which the FBI was doing. Infiltration of these groups, rat fucking them from within, turning them against each other, creating these violent crimes that they could be blamed on them so that the American people would turn against them. So part of this was this MKUltra mind control, where you create this little cult, and then at some point when they're ready and you've nurtured them along, and you've primed them for this event, now you, through hypnosis and drugs, you program them to go commit this heinous crime, and the fallout and the attention of that creates this fear, generates this fear and this paranoia of the groups that you're going to blind. It's a false flag. It's no different than Operation Northwoods, which the CIA proposed and the Joint Chiefs proposed to commit a terrorist attack against an American target on American soil and blame it on Cuba, so that the American people want to go fight a war against Cuba, right? Which I believe was the JFK assassination. Is there a bigger target than the American president? Happened in Dallas, blamed it on a Cuban sympathizer, Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, that's sort of what this is. But instead it's of trying, the end result being a war against Cuba. The end result here is the FBI and CIA trying to create a war against our own population. We're trying to divide Americans and cause this fear, this paranoia, and this state of panic that the civil rights movement is evil, or the anti-war movement is evil, and they're trying to uh, they're all drugged up, and they're run around committing murders, and something needs to be done against these people because they're out of control. That was the whole point of COINTELPRO and chaos. So it's what they call mass conversion. Instead of conversion one person at a time, it's mass conversion. You train this crackpot leader in the use of LSD and hypnosis, and then they pass that knowledge along and use it to influence their followers into violent criminality. The Charles Manson family did. You make people so pliable, they'll violate their own moral codes. They have no memories of their actions afterwards. So you interrogate them. Uh, and it's interesting. This all started as a way to get information out of POWs and spies, right? To get a truth serum and get them to tell the truth. Well, as a result of all of this research, we have figured out a way to commit these crimes through these proxies, and then they have no memory afterwards. It's not like you can interrogate it out of them. You can't torture it out of them. You can't use drugs or hypnosis to get it out of them. The memory has been wiped clean. There's nothing you can do to get that information back. It's gone. The desired outcome, as I said before, is to demonstrate the failures to the American people as a whole, the failure of 60s idealism through these false flag operations. Now, here's where Jolly West comes in. In his own writings, Jolly West, as he's reporting back to his boss, Sidney Gottlieb, and then his boss, Alan Dulles, he says the key to these experiments are great, but at some point we must put this what we've learned to test in practical trials in the field. In other words, we got to do it for real. The experiments are great, but we got to do it for real. In April of 1956, Dr. West reported, this is Jolly West, all right, that his experiments have succeeded in replacing true memories with false ones in human beings without their knowledge. So he is reporting up the chain that as a result of this Haight-Ashbury Clinic thing that's going on in San Francisco, that he has been able to replace true memories with false ones through a combination of drugs and hypnosis. And of course, and so that's in April. This is documented. This is April 56. Fast forward 7 years, October 63. As a result of his further research, he is now reporting in another document that with LSD and other drugs, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation, he could produce temporary mental illness effects in normal people. So you take a normal person, introduce into their experience LSD, maybe a drug cocktail, maybe it's a few other drugs, but LSD always. Hypnosis and sleep deprivation, you could actually drive a person to mental insanity. Now, he specified that it was temporary. It wasn't permanent, it was temporary. And this is useful knowledge. You then look at the date, October 63. This is 1 month before JFK is assassinated. Now, fast forward to April 26, 1964. At the request of, basically, he was ordered to do this by his bosses. Knowing what they know that he has expertise in because he has documented to them what he now knows how to do, they send him on April 26, 1964 to meet with Jack Ruby alone in jail. There's no cameras. There's no guards. Sound familiar? No one's present. It's a one-on-one meeting with the most notorious man in America at that time. And it would be Lee Harvey Oswald, but he's dead because Ruby killed him. And this is right before, this is 64, the Warren Commission is meeting, and they're preparing to come interview the man who probably knows the most about the JFK assassination. They should have started with this guy. But they haven't, the field has not been prepared yet. Ruby might talk and might force the Warren Commission to actually investigate something if he says something that they can't ignore. So before they go to visit him, before they get in a plane and go to Dallas, Dulles, through Gottlieb, sends Jolly West to meet with Ruby. And without cameras and without any guards present, He goes in and he meets with him for several hours. And when he emerges afterwards, the media asks him what happens. And he announces that during the meeting that he has just had with Ruby, Ruby had experienced a, quote, psychotic break with reality. And he talked about how Ruby got down on all fours. And he was crawling around like a mad dog. He was banging his head against the prison walls to the point where blood was coming out the back of his head. He was screaming about babies being eaten. And I mean, it was just crazy stuff. It was just crazy stuff. Well, after that, the Warren Commission flies down to Dallas, meets with Ruby, and announces to the public, to the media, no information of any value was found. Ruby had no information of any value to add to give us to the Warren Commission. And they washed their hands of Jack Ruby, went back to Washington. At that meeting, Ruby begged Chief Justice Earl Warren, please take me back to Washington. And he's blathering like an idiot. He's saying all this nonsense. But he had a moment of lucidity enough to beg Warren to take him back to Washington. I'll tell you everything you need to know back in Washington. I can't tell you here, my life's in danger. They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me with cancer. They're going to put cancer in my food, which, of course, they took as another crazy comment. Turns out it wasn't so crazy. But this is the practical application of MKUltra, whereby a witness who was in a position, who was in the know about what happened in the JFK assassination, was primed by Dr. Jolly West, who, according to his own documents, had succeeded in replacing true memories with false ones and causing temporary insanity in people. Then, after he met with Ruby and Ruby went insane, temporarily, not permanently, the Warren Commission flies down, meets with him, and announces nothing of value from this guy. You see the value for the CIA in this? Okay, so back to the Manson case, which is what the book Chaos is all about. You think about the victims that came out of Operation Chaos and the Haight-Ashbury Project. You got Charles Manson and his family. You know, he was like Whitey Bulger, like Theodore Kaczynski, like Sirhan Sirhan, which we're going to get to. There's others. He was chosen for this experiment. He was hypnotized, he was drugged up, and then he was recruited to, or the CIA used him to recruit converts, disciples from this group of hippies that are wandering around in the streets. And through him, they provided these disciples with an unlimited supply of drugs and sex, all the things that they were experimenting back in Operation Midnight Climax. Drugs and sex. How does it change people's behavior? And what they learned from that, they put into practice through Charles Manson. And what did Charles Manson's family mainly focus on? Drugs and sex. That's not a coincidence, folks. And then when they were sufficiently primed, they went on a killing spree. And Manson didn't do it. Manson ordered his family members to go do it. And these teenage 21, 22-year-old something girls and a couple guys went out and killed all these people I've got pictured here. 9 victims. That's who we know. There's suspicion that they killed a lot of people in addition to that out in the desert. And they just sort of disappeared. But we know of the 9 because those are the high profile. And you notice something similar about all 9. They're all white. And on the walls, they painted Helter Skelter, which is, and race war and pigs and death to pigs, all this kind of stuff, trying to create the impression that this was a civil rights organization going bad. This is a false flag. And the cover up of all this was the helter-skelter motive that Vincent Bugliosi came up with. Helter-skelter, that Charles Manson was some pseudo prophet that said that the end of the world was going to come and there was going to be this massive race war between black and white. Blacks were going to win. The only whites that were going to be left was Charles Manson and his little colony out in the desert somewhere. And he tried to turn it into some mythical kind of religious thing as a cover. But really what this was Operation Chaos. Some would say gone bad. It didn't go bad. It accomplished exactly what the CIA and what Jolly West, remember Jolly West said, the experiment's fine, but you have to test this out, practically speaking, in the real world to know if it works. It did work. And you think about what justice there was. Well, Charles Manson went to prison for the rest of his life. Whatever memory or whatever knowledge he had, he never shared. Probably because he didn't have any memory of it, right? And all of his girls and everybody who went to jail for him, no one had any knowledge that led back to the CIA. No one had any knowledge that led back to Operation Chaos or Jolly West or Sidney Gottlieb or Alan Dulles or Operation Chaos. To this day, people think Charles Manson was some deranged prophet that got these girls to follow him around because he gave them drugs and sex, and they became so hypnotized by him that they would do anything. Like it was just all because of him. He was a vehicle by which the CIA accomplished this Operation Chaos. That was the whole point of it. So, and the helter-skelter motive was just to cover up. So, back to Sirhan. I've gone off on a wild goose here, Chase, but I think it's necessary to understand where we go next, where this all came from. So on April 28, 2011, during 60 hours of prison interviews, some with hypnosis, some without. Now, understand this is 2011, so this is after, we've had almost 60 years of this research with hypnosis and drugs, etc. Daniel Brown, who is a Harvard University professor, he's an expert in trauma memory and hypnosis. He went and interviewed Sirhan, and he said that under hypnosis, after he was given a cue, which is how this works, I call it an activating agent before, but they call it a cue. Sirhan said that after he was given a cue from, quote, the girl, he went into range mode. And he described range mode as believing that he was at a firing range and he was seeing circles with targets in front of his eyes. Quote, I thought that I was at the range more than I was actually shooting at any person, let alone Bobby Kennedy. This is what he's telling Daniel Brown. Now, according to eyewitnesses, and this is the first I've mentioned this, but according to eyewitnesses, in 1968, after the RFK assassination, eyewitnesses said they saw a girl in a polka dot dress running out of the Ambassador Hotel after the shooting, shouting, quote, we shot Kennedy. All right, this never came up at the trial, right? This never came up until 2011 when Daniel Brown is interviewing Sirhan, and he puts him under hypnosis, and all of a sudden, Sirhan has memory. When he's not hypnotized, he does two different sessions. He does sessions where he's hypnotized, he does sessions where he's not. When he's not hypnotized, he has no memory of any of this, including the crime. But when he's hypnotized, he remembers all these details. which this is how MKUltra works. The hypnosis allows the CIA or whomever programmer is to program you to do something against your will or against something you wouldn't normally do, to commit a crime, basically. The combination of hypnosis and drugs. And afterwards, when you're not hypnotized anymore, you have no memory of it. Now, if you're still hypnotized, you will have memory of it. But what they do is they activate a cue or a code where on that cue, you become hypnotized and you go into this trance and you do what you've been programmed to do. And then there will be another cue given at the end or given at the beginning. When you see this, or when after you have done this, you will come out of hypnosis. And so boom, they snap out of it and they have no memory of it. So Daniel Brown conducts these 2 sessions with Sirhan, one without hypnosis, and he can't get anything out of him. And then he hypnotizes him, and Sirhan goes into range mode, starts talking about a girl. And of course, researchers know that eyewitnesses had talked about this girl wearing this polka dot dress. And so Daniel Brown goes back, and as you see, this is still on April 28th, and asks about the girl. Again, 2 different sessions, one with hypnosis, one without. Under hypnosis, Sirhan remembers meeting the girl that night and becoming smitten with her. And he tells the story, how she led him to the pantry. He says, quote, this is Sirhan talking, I was under hypnosis. I was trying to figure out how to hit on her. That's all that I could think about. I was fascinated with her looks. She never said much. It was very erotic. I was consumed by her. She was a seductress with an unspoken unavailability. So this is all coming out in the aftermath, that Sirhan remembers this girl in the polka dot dress, which corroborates what these eyewitnesses said they saw in the immediate aftermath. Sirhan, all these years later, under hypnosis, remembers this girl, how he met her, and he starts to talk about her. Here you see a few articles on the left. Here, this dancer said she was the polka dot dress girl. On the far right, this is the girl that actually was questioned and actually testified in the trial about whether she was a polka dot girl. And of course, everybody said it turns out she couldn't have been. The girl in the middle actually more closely resembles the description that Sirhan gives for this girl in the polka dot dress. He maintains in these hypnotic interviews that, quote, the mystery girl touched him or pinched him on the shoulder just before he fired, then spun him around to see people coming through the pantry door. And he says, quote, then I was on the target range, a flashback to the shooting range. I didn't know that I had a gun, Sirhan said. Brown said that under the condition of hypnotic free recall, he said Sirhan remembered seeing the flash of a second gun at the time of the assassination. But now this was all under hypnosis. Everything he remembered about the girl, everything he remembered about the second gun, the flash from the second gun, everything he remembered about that night and the events of that night were under hypnosis. Without hypnosis, Sirhan could not remember the girl, the second shot, anything. So it speaks to someone who has been programmed using hypnosis, because hypnosis is the trigger that causes the recall. Without it, he has amnesia, which is the point of MKUltra. Mind control. Control someone programmed to do something against their will, have no memory of it afterwards. How do you program? Through hypnosis. When they're hypnotized, they're carrying out what they've been programmed to do. While they're in that state, they know what they're doing. They remember what they're doing. As soon as they come out of that state, they have no memory. That's exactly what Sirhan has exhibited, that kind of behavior. So the MKUltra theory is that Sirhan's behavior was modified through a combination of hypnosis and drugs. Here he is, this young guy, and just like Charles Manson's behavior was modified, just like his disciples, all these young teenage girls, all their behaviors were modified to the same thing, hypnosis and drugs. So that enabled the CIA to gain control, the physical and mental control that they had over Sirhan, all his future activities, and then with a guarantee of amnesia afterwards. To this day, he doesn't remember. You know, when he's not meeting with Daniel Brown and being hypnotized, he has no memory. Yeah, he's had motive to try to remember. I remember it was last year, a couple years ago, he was up for his last parole, and Gavin Newsom said, if you just, express remorse for what you did, the parole board recommended parole. Ultimately, the decision was up to the governor, and Newsom was waiting to hear that he had remorse for what he did. And he says, how can I express remorse? I don't remember it. I don't remember doing it. You say I did it? I guess maybe I did it, but how can I express remorse? I don't remember it. That amnesia has continued to this day. By gaining control over Sirhan, the CIA programmed its Manchurian candidate to act against his own moral concepts. Remember, he said under hypnosis, I didn't even know I had a gun in my hand. She just pinched me, turned me around, and there's all the people. That's what he remembered. He's a Manchurian candidate in the sense that he was patsy. He was an empty suit. They had gained control over another human being, and he was doing like they had a remote control back there, and they were telling him what to do, programmed him what to do, and then afterwards wiped the slate clean so he can't remember anything. This also, by the way, if you remember back, I think I said in episode 1 or 2, I don't remember. These two big guys jumped on him, Rayford Johnson and Rosie Greer. I mean, big dudes. Remember, Sirhan was tiny. So these big dudes jumped on him. They're trying to get the gun out of his hand. And according to Rayford Johnson, he had superhuman strength. They could not get the gun out of his hand. This is another trait of mind control, being controlled by a combination of hypnosis and drugs. You have a strength about you that it is literally, like Rayford Johnson said, superhuman. And after you come out of hypnosis, you're this frail little guy who can be pushed around easily. But when you're in this disassociative state, this hypnotic state, you have this superhuman strength about you. And they could not figure out why they couldn't get that gun out of his hand. And that's why they had to tackle him and just aim the gun in another direction. So when you start putting all these factors together, it starts to appear like the RFK assassination was a setup. And again, connecting the dots with all the other people that were involved in it, the shooter, Thane Eugene Caesar, CIA connections. Now you look at Sirhan and the programming, the unwitting program he's experienced, again, from the CIA. And then you look at the connections of the LAPD to the CIA, Pena running the whole investigation, the rigged trial. It looks like the government, through this Operation Chaos, created a means by which and MKUltra created this programmed assassin with no memory afterwards. And of course, he serves as the convenient patsy and has been in prison ever since. There's evidence of range mode programming used to set up Sirhan as a distraction in the pantry. You remember now, this is, again, evidence of CIA complicity whenever they use a diversion tactic. We've gone through this before. the Texas School Book Depository was a distraction, a diversion. The shot came from that first shot in order for the kill shot to come from another location, the grassy knoll. In the kitchen, Sirhan was the distraction while the kill shot came from behind his right ear from Thane Eugene Caesar. When we get to Martin Luther King, the distraction was the flop house while the kill shot came from another location. So then you talk about physical and verbal cues, which, according to Sirhan, came from this girl allegedly wearing a polka dot dress, prompting a programmed Sirhan to assume a firing stance, enter range mode, you could see the target, and start firing at the target, who was RFK. Walked right into that target. And then afterwards, the programming conditioned Sirhan to completely forget everything he just did. And who programmed or him to do it, any connections he had to anybody. It's all gone. So the theory is that this girl in this polka dot dress who was seen with Sirhan, she was in the coffee area before, so witnesses saw her several times, and this girl was seen with Sirhan serving him coffee before the event. And then she walked him to the pantry by the elbow and literally escorted him into that pantry area of the kitchen. And then afterwards, eyewitnesses who had also seen her before drinking the coffee, giving the coffee to Sirhan, walking him to the pantry, also saw her later leaving the Ambassador Hotel screaming, "We shot Kennedy," or saying it loudly. So the theory is the girl in the polka dot dress, who was seen with Sirhan before and after, or before and then later after fleeing the scene, gave Sirhan these cues. And that caused him to enter range mode and to fire involuntarily against his own wishes, against his own moral code at Kennedy with no conscious intent to kill him. And of course, set him up in advance, with the article, the news article that was in his pants pocket and back in his apartment. They had a notebook with RFK must die, RFK must die, RFK must die. Set him up just like they did Oswald with all the sheep dipping and all the stuff they had him do prior to, New Orleans and in Dallas, prior to the assassination, that would make him look awful guilty to establish a motive. So this was all set up. And poor Sirhan, here he is. This picture of 2013, so it's a little old, but he's been, the last parole denial was in 2022. He's been in prison for 54 years. And he's still, in all the history books, he's still blamed for killing Robert Kennedy. Now, we know for a fact he did not kill Robert Kennedy because we talked about the autopsy and the ballistics. Impossible for him to have killed RFK. Okay, impossible. So we know that's not true. But all the history books, that's what you learn, right? That's why he's still in prison. He wouldn't be in prison for attempted murder by now. He'd been released. He's not innocent of everything, whether he was hypnotized or not. He did start the shooting, but he did not kill RFK. Those bullets came from behind. And there were way more bullets fired than he had in his chamber of his gun. The question is, what was he? If he was not the murderer and he had no motive, it was all manufactured to kill RFK, why did he shoot at him? Why does he have no memory of it? Right? He's been consistent with that for 54 years. Why did this tiny little man have superhuman strength? Why did he, under hypnosis with Daniel Brown, have all these details that are corroborated by other people who were at the scene? Unless he was part of Operation Chaos, like Charles Manson was, like Theodore Kaczynski was, like Whitey Bulger was, and used by the government to commit a crime, and also be the patsy in that crime. it's it's, you know, I would encourage you to read that book by Tom O'Neill and understand that I know it's a lot to digest. The fact that we were involved in this study going back to World War II, but it's not. We didn't arrive at the MKUltra, the RFK assassination, all these MKUltra events overnight. It was a long process, decade after decade. We experimented first on foreign populations in Korea and Vietnam and the Philippines, Southeast Asia. And then at some point we brought it home. We experimented on our own people, people that were young, you know, away from home, like college students, people in hospitals, people in prisons. We experimented on our own soldiers. We experimented on these people. We had no problem killing them. For a long time, we only experimented on pigs and mice and things of that nature. But as soon as the Germans came over and taught us about how this stuff works and how they did it, we crossed a line and killed 26,000 Vietnamese in the process. How many Koreans, we don't know. And, you know, families actually took the United States government to court and won court cases against the government as a result of MKUltra and how their family members their minds had been broken. And in courts of law, the government had to admit guilt and pay big damage settlements. So this is not conspiracy theory. This is not uh, speculation. This has actually made it into courtroom proceedings whereby the government had to admit that this program existed, that they engaged in these activities, and these people were victims. And a lot of them were American citizens. Now, they won't ever admit that they programmed Sirhan. They won't ever admit that they hypnotized and controlled Charles Manson and his family. They won't ever admit that Dr. Frank Olson was murdered because he was threatening to reveal what they were doing. They won't ever admit that Whitey Bulger was an informant for them, and all these people were part of this program. But that's how the government operates. You only admit what you're forced to admit. And and so to this day, they will never admit that Jack Ruby was a victim of this program, because of the knowledge that he could have had to blow open the JFK case. But boy, I tell you what, Alan Dulles was right. It is ultra. If you can control people's minds and their behaviors and their memories, that is the ultimate weapon. And that's what Sirhan became, the ultimate weapon. They committed the crime and they got away with it by using this ultimate weapon that they themselves created. All right, that's the end of my RFK series. It was inspired by the recent document release, which everybody's talking about the JFK part of it, but there was also documents supposed to be released relating to RFK and MLK. I've not seen those yet, and I'm curious as to when they're going to be released. I haven't seen any media attention on that. So anyway, when and if they do get released, because I think all three of these assassinations are related, I wanted to at least have been on record talking about the facts of the case as I understand them, so that you can juxtapose what you've learned through these videos with whatever we learn from the documents, and hopefully we learn more. I don't know. We'll see, but I've never done any videos specific to the RFK assassination, so now I have. And my next series will be on Martin Luther King, which you will notice as we get into that, a lot of similarities to what we just talked about, with the exception of it being an MKUltra style hit. This is not that, but everything else is very similar. So we'll get into that later. I'm busy researching all that right now. So anyway, until next time, hope everybody has a very blessed day, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.